Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I used to think the wilderness was peaceful, that it was a place to escape the chaos of the city, to find solitude among the trees, and breathe in air untainted by human touch. But after what happened, I'll never step foot in the forest again. The sound of the wind rustling through the branches or the soft crunch of leaves beneath my feet no longer brings me comfort. They only remind me of one thing: the creature that lurks deep within the wilderness, a nightmare I can never forget. My name is Aaron, and this is my story. It started a year ago. I had always been an avid hiker, often venturing deep into the woods alone. I loved the silence, the way the towering trees swallowed the sounds of civilization. There was something about losing myself in nature that grounded me, made me feel alive. So when I heard about a remote trail in the heart of the Smoky Mountains, a trail so hidden it wasn't even on official maps, I couldn't resist. I packed my gear for a weekend trip, determined to reach the untouched depths of that forest. It wasn't the first time I had taken an off-the-grid route, but there was something different about this one. The locals had warned me not to go. Old-timers in the nearby town of Clayton spoke in hushed tones, muttering about strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances. I brushed it off as superstition. Every small town had its urban legends, right? The trail was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. I followed a rudimentary map I'd found online, which led me deeper and deeper into the wilderness. By the time I set up camp on the first night, I hadn't seen another soul in hours. It was exactly what I wanted: complete isolation. Or so I thought. As darkness crept in, I built a fire and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sky was clear, the stars above piercing through the canopy like tiny diamonds. Everything was calm until I heard it. A distant scream. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of scream that came from a person. It was guttural, animalistic, and yet something about it felt wrong. I froze, straining to listen. Silence. The kind that presses down on you, heavier than it should be. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was a fox or some other wildlife, it came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, but all I saw were the towering pines swaying gently in the wind. The fire crackled softly behind me, casting flickering shadows that danced just out of view. I told myself to relax, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the isolation was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, set my nerves on edge. By morning, the uneasy feeling still clung to me like a second skin. I decided to push further into the trail, hoping that maybe whatever had disturbed me the night before would be left behind. As I hiked, the trees became denser, the air cooler. There was an odd stillness, an unnatural quiet that seemed to blanket the forest. Even the birds were silent. The deeper I went, the more oppressive it became, like the woods themselves were trying to warn me away. By the afternoon, I reached a small clearing. In the center stood a lone cabin, weathered and abandoned. It looked like it had been forgotten for decades. The windows were shattered, the wood splintered and rotting, but what struck me the most was the stench. A foul, decaying odor that hit me the moment I stepped into the clearing. My stomach churned. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve as I approached the cabin. I don't know why I didn't turn back right then and there. Some sick curiosity pushed me forward, like I needed to see what was inside. The door hung loosely on its hinges. I nudged it open with the tip of my boot, and the foul smell intensified. Inside, the floor was littered with old newspapers, broken furniture, and bones. Dozens of bones. animal, I told myself. But some were too large, too human-like to be easily dismissed. I stepped further in, my heart pounding. There were strange markings carved into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. They twisted and spiraled, almost alive in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. And then, as I stood in the center of the room, I saw it. Something that sent a cold shock of terror through my veins. On the far wall, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "It watches." Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I heard it again, that scream. But this time, it was right outside. I spun around, my flashlight flickering in the sudden dusk. The scream was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, fast and deliberate, moving through the trees. I bolted out of the cabin, my heart racing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Only silence. Thick, oppressive silence. I backed away from the cabin, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run. But as I turned to head back down the trail, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Something tall, impossibly tall, standing between the trees. It was watching me. Its body was thin and elongated, its limbs too long, too bent at unnatural angles. I couldn't see its face, if it had one, but its eyes. God, its eyes. They glowed faintly in the growing darkness, two pinpricks of light that bored into me. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. And then, without warning, it let out that scream, a deafening, bone-chilling wail that echoed through the trees and rattled my skull. I ran. I didn't care where. I just ran, branches slapping against my face, my feet barely keeping up with my body as I barreled through the forest. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its footsteps heavy and relentless. No matter how fast I ran, it was faster. The trail blurred before my eyes, and I knew I wouldn't make it. I wasn't going to outrun this thing. Desperation clawed at my chest, my legs burning with exhaustion. And then, as if the forest itself had swallowed me whole, I lost the trail entirely. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded. I collapsed, gasping for air, every muscle in my body screaming in agony. I listened, praying I wouldn't hear that scream again. Nothing, just the eerie stillness of the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I huddled against a tree, clutching a rock as my only weapon, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. By morning, I somehow found my way back to the trail. My legs were shaking, my mind numb from fear. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but I did. I drove away from that place, vowing never to return. I still hear it sometimes, late at night when the wind howls outside my window. That scream, that awful, inhuman wail. It's out there, somewhere in the deep wilderness, waiting for the next fool to wander too far, waiting for its next victim. Some objects carry with them a history so dark, so twisted, that even looking at them can feel like you've made a mistake. I never believed in curses before, but now, every time I look at the scars on my hands, I wonder if they'll ever fade, or if they'll be the last thing I see. I wasn't supposed to be in that shop. The whole thing started because of a series of bad decisions I made, like everyone else who ends up entangled in something far bigger than they can handle. My name is Adam, and I'm 32 years old, living in a city that was always too big for me. I came to New York to escape the quiet, the stillness of my hometown, and found myself suffocated by the noise instead. That day was like any other. I was out wandering, half-heartedly looking for a gift for my sister's birthday, when I stumbled across a small antique store wedged between two towering skyscrapers. It wasn't flashy, barely noticeable, but something about it called to me. I should have kept walking, but curiosity has a funny way of pulling you into things you'd be better off avoiding. The shop was dimly lit. the smell of dust thick in the air. Shelves crammed with old books, faded photographs, and strange knickknacks lined the walls. The kind of place that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. At the counter sat an elderly man, eyes clouded with age, but they sparkled with a strange intensity when he saw me enter. "You looking for something special?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "I guess," I replied, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. He nodded knowingly, as if he had seen hundreds like me before, lost souls searching for something they couldn't name. "Take your time." I wandered through the store, running my hands over old globes, tarnished silverware, and brittle paperbacks. And then, in the back corner of the room, I saw it. A small, intricately carved wooden box, no bigger than a cigar case. Its surface was etched with symbols I didn't recognize, patterns that seemed to twist and move under the flickering light. My fingers tingled as I picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer, not on a dusty shelf. A strange urge came over me to open it, to see what was inside. But something in the back of my mind, some buried instinct, told me not to. "How much for this?" I asked, holding the box up to the old man at the counter. His smile faded. His eyes, once twinkling, darkened. "That one's not for sale." I blinked, taken aback. "But it's just sitting here." He shook his head, his expression grave. "It's cursed. That box has brought death to everyone who's owned it." I laughed, more out of discomfort than amusement. "Cursed? Seriously?" The man didn't smile. "It's not a joke, son. Put it back where you found it and forget you ever saw it." I should have listened. But something about his warning, about the way his voice trembled ever so slightly, only made me want the box more. I don't know if it was arrogance or plain stupidity, but I wasn't about to leave empty-handed. "How much?" I pressed again. The man stared at me for a long moment before sighing, defeated. $50. But don't say I didn't warn you." I handed him the cash without a second thought, ignoring the gnawing feeling in my gut. As I left the shop, I could feel his eyes burning into my back, but I didn't look back. I wish I had. The first night after I brought the box home, I had a dream. I was standing in a dark, endless field, the air thick with fog. In the distance, I could see a figure, shadowy and indistinct, walking toward me. No matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the ground, my arms heavy as lead. The figure got closer, and I could see it more clearly now. A man, his face pale and hollow, eyes black as the void. He smiled, a twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. "You opened the door," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Now you must pay the price." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The box sat on my nightstand, untouched, but the room felt colder than it should have been. I told myself it was just a dream, but deep down, I knew better. Things started happening after that, little things at first. Objects in my apartment would move on their own, nothing dramatic, just small shifts that made me question my memory. The lights flickered more often, and no matter how many times I replaced the bulbs, the problem persisted. Then there were the whispers. Low, almost imperceptible, but always there when I was alone. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I heard a loud crash from the living room. I ran in to find the box had fallen off the table, the lid now slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my hands shaking. I hadn't opened it since bringing it home, but now it seemed to be calling to me, begging to be opened. I couldn't resist. Inside was a small piece of parchment yellowed with age. The writing on it was faded, but I could still make out a single sentence. "Death follows those who seek what's hidden." A cold dread settled over me. I tried to put the box away, to forget about it, but the nightmares only got worse. Each night the figure in the field came closer, his face more grotesque, more decayed, and each time he whispered the same words. You opened the door. Now you must pay. I became obsessed with the box, researching its symbols, its origins. Every thread led to a dead end, no record of it in any book or website. It was like the box didn't exist, like it was some anomaly that had slipped through the cracks of reality. Then the death started. It began with a neighbor. Mrs. Green, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment below mine, was found dead in her kitchen. The cause was never determined. Her heart had simply stopped. A week later, a man from across the street was hit by a car. Another 2 days, and my coworker Jack collapsed at his desk, never to wake up. The strange thing was, each of them had interacted with the box in some way. Mrs. Green had borrowed a cup of sugar and seen it sitting on my counter. The man across the street had asked me about it when he saw me carrying it home. And Jack? Well, Jack had touched it when I showed him during lunch, laughing off my concerns. I couldn't deny it any longer. The box was cursed, and death followed it. I knew I had to get rid of it, but every time I tried, something stopped me. I would put it in the trash, only to find it back on my nightstand the next morning. I even tried burning it, but the flames refused to catch. I'm writing this now because I know my time is running out. The figure in my dreams is almost upon me, his breath cold on my skin. I can feel him watching, waiting for the moment when I finally succumb. The box sits next to me as I type, its lid slightly ajar, as if mocking me. I don't know how much longer I have, but if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Some objects aren't meant to be owned. Some doors should never be opened. And if you ever find yourself in a small, dimly lit antique shop and an old man tells you something isn't for sale, listen to him. I never thought much about basements. Sure, they were dark and creepy, but to me, they were just storage spaces for old junk and forgotten things. Until I moved into that house. The place had been on the market for months, maybe even longer, and it was going cheap. Too cheap. But I didn't question it at the time. Fresh out of college, I was just glad to find something I could afford. The house was small, kind of isolated on the outskirts of town, but charming in its own way. Plus it had a basement, a big one, perfect for storing all the things I didn't want cluttering my living space. The first time I went down there, I could feel it. The change in the air was immediate. You know that feeling when you're being watched, like someone's eyes are drilling into the back of your head? Yeah, it was like that. I brushed it off as nerves. New house, old building, creaky floors. Nothing unusual, or so I convinced myself. I tried not to spend too much time down there. There was something about the basement that gnawed at me. The walls were made of stone, rough and cold to the touch, like they had seen centuries pass. The light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered constantly, no matter how many times I changed it. But it wasn't just that. There was a smell, too. A damp, earthy odor that never seemed to go away, no matter how many air fresheners I used. And there was a coldness. A natural, bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. For weeks, I avoided it. But eventually, life gets in the way. Boxes needed to be unpacked, and I couldn't keep pretending the basement didn't exist. One Saturday, I finally gathered up the courage and went down to organize my stuff. That's when things started getting weird. I had barely been down there for 10 minutes when I heard it. A faint sound, like someone shuffling behind me. I turned around so fast I nearly knocked over a stack of boxes, but there was nothing. The air was still, and the silence that followed was deafening. My heart was racing, but again, I told myself it was just nerves. I was jumpy, that's all. The next time, it was worse. I was rummaging through a box of old books when I heard a soft creak, like footsteps on the stairs. But it wasn't just the sound that got to me. No, it was the fact that the basement door was shut, locked even. I'd made sure of it. The only way someone could have gotten in was through the door, and no one was there. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. I waited for something, anything to happen. But the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they'd started. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was settling, I reasoned, or there was a draft. But deep down, I knew better. Things escalated quickly after that. One night I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard the basement door creak open. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow, as if someone, or something, was making its way up the basement stairs. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with it in the dark, and listened as the steps grew closer. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. But after a few agonizing moments, there was nothing. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the basement was now just outside my door, watching, waiting. Morning came, and the door was still shut, just as I had left it. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but there was no shaking the dread that settled deep in my gut. The final straw came one night when I was in the living room, trying to distract myself from the creeping fear that had taken root in my mind. The TV was on, but I wasn't really paying attention. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, the footsteps, the strange feeling of being watched. Then the lights started flickering. First, it was just a quick dimming, but soon they were flashing wildly, like someone was flipping the switch on and off repeatedly. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It was coming from the basement. "Come down." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Come down." I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I stood up, my body moving on its own, and walked to the basement door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. I could feel the cold seeping through the wood, colder than anything I had ever felt. I hesitated, but that voice, it wouldn't stop. "Come down." With a deep breath, I opened the door. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to stretch out, endless and suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, but something urged me forward. Step by step, I descended into the blackness. The air was thick with that earthy smell, but now it was stronger, almost overwhelming. And then, just as I reached the bottom, the light above flickered on. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the basement, shrouded in shadow, its back turned to me. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming for me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to cooperate. All I could do was stare at the thing standing in the corner. Then it turned. I don't know what I expected to see, a face maybe, or at least some semblance of a person. But there was nothing. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, an empty blackness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. And then it smiled. Not a normal smile. No, this was something far worse. The edges of its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It took a step toward me. That broke whatever trance I was in. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not daring to look back. I could hear the thing following me, its heavy footsteps echoing behind me, but I didn't stop. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. For the rest of the night, I sat huddled on the couch, every light in the house turned on, clutching a kitchen knife in my trembling hands. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare close my eyes. I could still feel it, whatever it was, on the other side of the door, waiting for me to come back. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the lease, Didn't care about anything other than getting as far away from that basement as possible. I never went back. But even now, months later, I can still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I'll hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, "Come down." And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't run? You ever get that feeling? The one where you're being watched. No one's around, no sounds but the wind in the trees. But somehow, every inch of your skin tingles like something's just out of sight, lurking. That's the feeling I can't shake whenever I think about that night, the night I met the faceless man. It's a memory I can't outrun, no matter how hard I try. It started innocently enough, as most horror stories do. My name is Ethan, and this happened 2 years ago when I was 28, living in a small, uneventful town in upstate New York. The kind of place where everyone knows each other's business, and you can leave your doors unlocked without a second thought. My girlfriend Jess and I had moved there for the quiet life. City living had worn us down, and this place seemed like the perfect escape. But now, I wish we had stayed in the city. At least there, the monsters wore human faces. That Friday night, Jess and I were invited to a bonfire by some neighbors. The air was crisp with the onset of autumn, leaves crunching beneath our feet as we made our way to the edge of the woods where the bonfire was set up. It was an old tradition in our town, celebrating the changing of the seasons with a fire and some good stories. I had no idea that one of those stories would soon become my own. The bonfire crackled as the group gathered around, laughing and swapping ghost stories. Some were ridiculous, meant to scare the new folks like us. But one story, in particular, sent a chill down my spine. It was told by an old man named Roy, who had lived in the town his whole life. "Y'all ever heard about the faceless man?" Roy said, his voice low and gravelly, barely audible over the crackling flames. "They say he's been around these parts for centuries, long before the town was even built. He doesn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless void where one should be. People who see him, well, they're never the same." I shifted uncomfortably, feeling Jess tighten her grip on my arm. The group fell silent, hanging on Roy's every word. "Some say he's a demon, others think he's some kind of ancient spirit. But one thing's for sure, if you see the faceless man, you're marked. He'll follow you, haunt you, and slowly drive you mad." Everyone chuckled nervously, but the unease lingered in the air like smoke from the fire. I laughed it off with the others, but inside, something about Roy's story gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way his eyes darkened when he spoke of it, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a bit farther into the trees that night. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a ghost story. The night wore on, and Jess and I decided to head back home. The trail that led back to town wound through the woods, and while it wasn't far, the darkness felt oppressive, the quiet unnatural. We walked hand in hand, the cold biting at our faces as we tried to laugh off the eerie vibe from the bonfire. Then, about halfway down the trail, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Something moved between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest, and strained my eyes to see. But there was nothing, only the silent trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. "Ethan?" Jess's voice broke the silence, concern evident in her tone. "What's wrong?" I forced a smile. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something." But as we continued walking, the feeling grew stronger, the sensation that we weren't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something following us. But every time I looked, the trail was empty. We finally reached our house, and the relief I felt as we stepped inside was palpable. Jess went straight to bed, exhausted from the night, but I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the dark woods beyond, trying to shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching. A soft tap on the window snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat, and I whipped around to face the window. Nothing. Just my reflection staring back at me in the glass, pale and wide-eyed. Then I saw it. A shadow moved just outside the window, slipping between the trees at the edge of our yard. My breath hitched, and I froze, staring into the dark, waiting for it to move again. And then it did. It stepped out of the shadows, slowly, deliberately. My blood ran cold as I saw it clearly for the first time. Tall, impossibly thin, dressed in a suit that seemed old and tattered. But its face, there was no face. Just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. The faceless man. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only stare, paralyzed by fear, as it stood there, unmoving, just watching. Or at least I assumed it was watching. How could I know? It had no eyes, no expression. Just the blank void of its face reflecting the dim moonlight. For what felt like hours, we remained locked in that silent standoff. My mind raced, desperate for answers, for some explanation, but there was none. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the faceless man turned and disappeared into the woods. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass, scanning the tree line. But there was nothing, just the empty, quiet night. I backed away, trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest. Sleep was out of the question. I stayed up all night, pacing, checking the windows, convinced that any moment I would see him again. But the hours dragged on, and the dawn finally broke without another sighting. I told Jess what I saw in the morning, but she chalked it up to too much whiskey and the lingering effects of Roy's story. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. The faceless man was real. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched never left me. I saw him again, sometimes out of the corner of my eye, other times standing just at the edge of the woods, always watching, never approaching. Jess didn't see him. No one else did either. Just me. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the faceless man standing at the foot of our bed, his blank face staring down at me, his long, bony fingers reaching out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, my heart racing. But no matter how hard I tried to shake the dreams, they came every night, relentless. And then, one night, he wasn't just in my dreams. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Jess was sound asleep beside me, undisturbed by the noise. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to open. But it never did. Instead, the door handle slowly twisted. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the door creaked open ever so slightly. Through the crack, I saw him, the faceless man, standing in the hallway, his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me, and then, without a sound, he stepped back into the shadows, the door swinging shut behind him. I bolted out of bed, throwing the door open, but the hallway was empty. Just like always. I checked the house, every room, every corner, but there was no sign of him. That was the last time I saw the faceless man. But I know he's still out there, watching, waiting. He never truly leaves once he marks you. And now, I can't help but wonder, how long until he comes back for me? I never should have taken that boat out. The weather had been too perfect, the water too calm, and the skies too clear. It felt like an invitation, a quiet call to venture deeper into the ocean, farther than I'd ever gone before. It was the kind of day that made you forget how merciless the sea could be. That was my first mistake. I wasn't a seasoned sailor, not by any means. My boat, the Vera, was a small fishing vessel that I used on weekends. It had been my father's before me, and in his hands it had always brought back its fill of fish. In mine, it had mostly been an escape from the drudgery of daily life. On that particular morning, I'd packed enough supplies for an afternoon trip and nothing more. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a few hours to clear my head. But something strange happened once I was out there, past the familiar buoys and channels. The horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, and I felt a pull, like the sea itself was whispering to me, urging me to keep going. I wish I had listened to the warning signs, the faint prickle on the back of my neck, the way the air seemed to still for just a moment. But I didn't. By the time I saw the fog rolling in, it was too late. It wasn't a natural fog, not like the kind I'd seen before. This one moved unnaturally fast, swallowing the sun and sky in a matter of minutes. It seemed to come out of nowhere, thick and impenetrable, suffocating the world around me in a blanket of eerie silence. I cut the engine, hoping to wait it out, but the silence that followed was worse. There were no seagulls, no waves lapping against the hull, just dead quiet. That's when I noticed it. A shape looming in the mist. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the light. But as the fog thinned ever so slightly, the outline became clearer. A ship, an enormous one, drifting toward me with no sound, no lights. My heart leaped into my throat. It wasn't possible. There shouldn't have been any ships this far out, especially not one this massive. The closer it came, the more I could make out the details. It was an old, decaying vessel, its sails torn and flapping in the wind that I couldn't feel. The hull was coated in a thick layer of algae and barnacles, as if it had been lost to the sea for centuries. I could swear the ship wasn't floating on the water, but hovering just above it. My blood ran cold. I heard of ghost ships before. Old sailors' tales meant to scare newcomers, but this was something different. The Vera began to drift toward the ship, as if being pulled by some invisible force. No matter how hard I fought with the wheel, I couldn't stop the motion. Panic set in as I realized I was heading straight for it, and there was nothing I could do. I could see the deck now, splintered wood and rusted chains, and then something worse. Figures moving about, shadows of men who didn't seem to belong to this world. They moved slowly, methodically, as if trapped in some eternal loop. Their clothes were tattered, hanging off their skeletal frames, and their faces were hidden behind rotting, hollow eyes. Suddenly, the Vera collided with the ghostly ship, but there was no crash, no jolt. It was as if we had passed through a veil, merging with the wreckage of the old ship. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. The figures on the deck turned toward me, their empty eyes locking onto mine. That's when I heard the first whisper. "I am the sea." It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. A chorus of voices rising from every corner of the ship, speaking in unison. "We are the lost." I stumbled back, my legs trembling beneath me. I needed to get out of there, to turn the boat around and flee, but my body wouldn't obey. The fog thickened again, closing in around me, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with a sadness that chilled me to the bone. "We are the forgotten." A figure stepped forward from the shadows, one that was more solid than the others. His face was hidden beneath a tattered hood, but I could see the glint of gold around his neck, a captain's medallion, tarnished and ancient. He raised his hand, pointing directly at me, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "You will join us." The air grew thick, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my ears as I fumbled for the ignition, desperate to get the engine started. The captain's figure loomed closer, his hand still outstretched, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Finally, the engine roared to life. I slammed the throttle forward, tearing away from the ghostly ship with a force that sent me sprawling to the deck. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to escape. But even as the Vera sped through the water, The whispers didn't stop. "We are always with you." I looked back, expecting to see the ship fading into the fog, but there was nothing. Just the empty sea stretching out in all directions. The fog had lifted, the sun shining again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That ship, it was still out there somewhere in the depths, waiting. And those voices, they had followed me. I don't know how long I sat there trembling on the deck, but eventually I made it back to shore. I tied up the boat, my hands shaking, and staggered up the dock, leaving the Vera behind. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, not after what had happened. For days I stayed away from the water, too terrified to go near it. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the whispers, they never stop. Even now, as I sit here, writing this down, I can still hear them. Faint, just on the edge of hearing, but always there. They come to me in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and still. They call to me, beckoning me back to the sea. I know, deep down, that I can't escape them forever. The ghost ship, it's waiting for me. Waiting for the day when I'll return to the water, and when I do, I won't come back. The sea doesn't forget its own. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but that wasn't the sound that sent a chill down my spine. Beneath the hum of the forest, under the whispers of the leaves, there was something else, a faint, distant scream, stretching through the woods like a desperate echo of a soul who'd lost its way. I was alone, but it didn't feel like it. My name is Liam Walker, and I'd come to investigate the mystery of Blackwood Forest, a remote place notorious in my town for one thing. People who entered often never came back. Those who did return came back changed, haunted, like they'd seen something too terrible to talk about. The stories were so outlandish that for a while, they were just local folklore. People talked about seeing faces in the trees, hearing names whispered in the wind, and even hearing the screams of lost souls. I didn't believe it, not until tonight. But here I was, flashlight in hand, trudging deeper into Blackwood's heart. I'd been dared to spend the night here, an impulsive decision fueled by equal parts arrogance and curiosity. Now, with each step, I was regretting that choice. The screams grew louder, though faint, as if they were just out of reach, like I was the only one who could hear them. The first hour was easy. I set up camp near an ancient-looking oak and sat on a rotting log, drinking a beer to settle my nerves. But the deeper the night got, the stranger things became. It started with shadows moving just outside my flashlight's beam. Nothing obvious, just a flicker here, a dark shape there. It was as if something was watching, hiding just beyond my sight. My mind screamed, "Leave." But my pride wouldn't let me. After all, they'd mock me if I backed out this soon. So, I took a deep breath and settled in for the long night, convinced that I'd face it out. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone crying. The voice was low, trembling, as if whoever was out there was injured and afraid. I tried to ignore it at first, but the crying grew louder, piercing through the stillness of the woods. And then it changed, becoming more desperate, like someone begging, pleading for help. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The crying stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it was deafening. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon, scanning the trees around me. Is anyone there?" I called again, hoping for no reply. This time, there was an answer. Not in words, but in footsteps. Faint, cautious, crunching leaves underfoot. They were coming closer. I raised the flashlight, shining it into the dark. The beam caught only the endless stretch of trees, twisted and gnarled like ancient bones. But the footsteps continued, steady, relentless, closer and closer. "Stay back," I shouted, voice wavering. The footsteps halted, just beyond my light's reach. I could feel the weight of a stare, intense, unyielding. But no matter where I aimed the flashlight, there was no one there. And then, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves whispering, a voice broke through the silence. It was a low, raspy voice calling my name. Liam! I froze. I knew I'd heard that voice before, but it was impossible. It sounded just like my dad who died in this very forest 20 years ago. My throat tightened, heart pounding so hard it hurt. It's not real, I told myself. You're hearing things. But the voice came again, clearer this time, and unmistakably his. Liam, why did you leave me? A knot formed in my stomach, a sickening wave of dread clawing its way up my throat. The memories came flooding back. I was 5 years old, and my dad had brought me here for a camping trip. We'd gotten separated during a hike, and he never made it out. Search parties combed through every inch of this place, but he was never found. They'd called it an accident, but a part of me always wondered if he'd left me on purpose, abandoning his family the way he'd disappeared that day. Dad? I whispered, voice barely audible. Silence. Just the echo of my own voice, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the forest. Then, without warning, the trees began to move. It wasn't just the wind. It was like they were alive, closing in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Shadows twisted and merged, forming shapes that almost looked human. Faces etched in agony, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Panicking, I stumbled back, tripping over a root, the flashlight slipping from my grip. I scrambled to grab it, but it rolled away, its beam illuminating something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, beneath a tree, there was a figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and staring directly at me. His face was pale, translucent almost, like he was barely there, but I knew him. I would know that face anywhere. It was my dad, but something was wrong. His eyes were empty, hollow, like two pits of darkness, and his mouth stretched wide, as if caught in an eternal scream. He raised a hand, fingers long and thin like branches, pointing at me. "Why did you leave me?" he whispered, his voice a low, guttural rasp that didn't sound human. I stumbled back, shaking my head. I didn't leave you," I stammered, words catching in my throat. "I was a kid. I tried to find you, I swear." But he kept coming, gliding closer, his feet barely touching the ground. The other shadows gathered around him, their faces twisted in expressions of grief and pain, like they were all trapped in a perpetual state of horror. Their mouths opened, and the sound that emerged was a chorus of screams, louder, filling the air, until it felt like my ears would burst. I turned and ran, sprinting through the dark, branches clawing at my face and arms. The screams followed, growing louder until they were all around me, drowning out my own panicked breaths. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away, had to escape before whatever was out there caught up to me. But the faster I ran, the louder the screams became, closing in from every direction. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating a small, shallow pond. I could see my reflection, wide-eyed, panting. And behind me, the shadows gathered at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Then, in the reflection, I saw him, my dad, standing right behind me, his hand reaching out, his face a twisted mask of rage and sorrow. "Stay," he whispered, his voice echoing around me. "Stay with us, Liam." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, icy fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron strong. The shadows closed in, their whispers merging into a single terrifying command. "Stay." And then, as if from a distance, I heard my own voice, whispering, pleading, "Don't leave me here." But I wasn't speaking. My mouth was closed, yet the words were spilling out of me. It was as if the forest itself was stealing my voice, drawing me into its depths, trapping me in its endless nightmare. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own face, staring back at me from the pond's surface, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. I never left Blackwood that night. Sometimes, they say, if you're brave enough to venture into those woods, you can still hear the screams of those who never returned, echoing through the trees like a warning, a reminder of the souls that the forest has claimed, and the souls it will claim again. And if you listen closely, you might even hear my voice among them. I hadn't planned on stepping foot into those woods again, not after what happened last winter. But there I was, my flashlight piercing through the dense, silent trees, each one standing like an ominous guard to a secret they'd never willingly share. The cold gnawed at my skin, making it feel like every nerve was screaming at me to turn back. But the memory of Jamie's face, the pure terror in his eyes when he vanished into the dark, kept me moving forward. I needed answers, even if that meant facing the unimaginable horror that lurked in those woods. My name is Paul Shepard. I'm 27, a journalist by trade, though my recent experiences would make anyone question why I'd ever return here voluntarily. The small town of Norwich, a nearly abandoned speck on the map deep in the north, had always had its share of spooky tales, but nothing quite like the Wendigo. The legends had always felt more like campfire stories than anything real, tales meant to keep kids close to home. But after Jamie's disappearance last winter, my gut told me that what we'd always brushed off as folklore was hiding something far darker. It started with a single rumor, a shadow in the woods, a figure too thin, too tall to be human. Jamie and I had been investigating stories from locals who swore they'd seen something. They'd describe hearing footsteps behind them, whispers that carried on the wind, or seeing a set of glowing eyes staring from the shadows. The stories always ended the same way, the shadow vanishing, leaving only the sound of their own heartbeat pounding in their ears. Jamie had been stubborn, more curious than cautious, eager to push boundaries. I warned him to tread carefully, that some things are better left unseen, but he just laughed it off, calling me superstitious. I wish I'd insisted harder. We'd been out that night, combing the woods for traces of the shadow when he disappeared, as if the trees had simply swallowed him whole. The only trace left was his flashlight, still burning dimly where he'd dropped it. I pushed deeper into the forest, the wind whispering through the bare branches above. The full moon hung low, casting long, twisting shadows over the snow. It was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I knew I wasn't alone out here, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But the pull to understand what happened, to find some trace of Jamie, outweighed my sense of self-preservation. It was then that I noticed the footprints, oddly spaced, clawed, and impossibly large. They trailed off ahead of me, leading into a part of the woods I'd never ventured before. I knelt to examine them closer, my breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The tracks didn't look like anything I'd seen before. Whatever made them was no ordinary animal. Following the tracks felt like signing a death warrant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were leading me somewhere. Somewhere Jamie had gone before me. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved forward, my flashlight catching glimpses of movement just beyond my line of sight, shadows shifting between the trees. Then came the sound. It started as a low moan, barely audible over the wind. But as I got closer, it grew louder, a tortured cry that seemed to echo from all directions. I froze, feeling my skin prickle as goosebumps crawled over me. It sounded like Jamie, his voice twisted with fear and something else, pain. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the sound, each step heavier than the last. The trees parted to reveal a small clearing, and in the center, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the darkness, thin and impossibly tall, with limbs that looked too long for its body. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, a sickly gray that seemed almost translucent in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin points of pale yellow that seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure's mouth opened slowly, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and from it came Jamie's voice, clear and desperate. "Help. Me." The voice sent a chill down my spine, more chilling than the freezing night air. This thing, it wasn't Jamie, but somehow it had his voice. I took a step back, but the creature moved, its head tilting to one side in a jerky, unnatural motion. It mimicked Jamie's voice again, this time quieter, almost a whisper. "Paul, don't leave me." My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The legends, the stories, they all came rushing back. The Wendigo, a creature cursed with insatiable hunger, feeding on the souls of the lost, mimicking their voices to lure others into its grasp. I'd always thought it was nothing more than a tale, a myth meant to keep people from wandering too far into the woods. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I raised the flashlight. The creature hissed, the sound scraping through the air like nails on a chalkboard, and its face contorted into a twisted grin. It stepped toward me, its movements disturbingly fluid, as if it were gliding over the ground. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the frozen ground, branches slapping against my face and tearing at my clothes. I could hear it behind me, moving faster than any creature had a right to, its breath a ragged whisper on the wind. "Don't leave me, Paul." The voice grew louder, closer, as if it were right next to me. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw those glowing eyes closer than ever, watching me with a hunger that made my blood turn to ice. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, my flashlight skittering away into the darkness. In the panic, I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight just as the creature loomed over me. It reached out, its long bony fingers inches from my face. In a last, desperate move, I swung the flashlight up, the beam catching it directly in the eyes. The creature screeched, stumbling back as if in pain. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran, my legs burning as I tore through the trees, not stopping until I could see the faint glow of the town's lights in the distance. I made it back to Norwich, breathless, half frozen and unable to speak. I tried to tell people what I'd seen, to explain what had happened to Jamie, but no one believed me. They told me I was traumatized, that grief had twisted my memory. But I know what I saw, and I know that Jamie is gone, taken by something not of this world. It's been months since that night, but I still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear Jamie's voice outside my window, calling to me. The same haunting, desperate cry that I heard in the woods. They say the Wendigo never stops hunting once it's chosen you. And I can feel it, a cold presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Every night it comes a little closer, its whispers growing louder, its hunger intensifying. I don't know how much longer I can keep running, but one thing is certain. Some things are better left in the dark, untouched and undisturbed. Because in the end, there's no escaping the Wendigo. It was a night meant for no one. The wind howled, gnawing at the brittle autumn leaves outside my house, scraping them across the porch in a scratching chorus that matched my mood. Insomnia had kept me awake for days, and every sound seemed magnified, every shadow elongated. I had settled into a restless state, staring at the blue glow of the clock on my nightstand, watching the minutes crawl toward midnight when it happened. Knock, knock. My head snapped toward the door. It was a soft knock, just a couple of taps, almost polite yet filled with something unnerving. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. In this town, even the most inconsiderate visitors respected the privacy night demanded. I lay there, holding my breath, convincing myself it was probably the wind, or maybe some tree branch reaching out, longing for connection. But then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock. I slid out of bed, wrapped my robe around me, and tiptoed down the stairs. As I got closer to the door, an unsettling chill crept up my spine. Through the peephole, I saw them. 2 kids standing on my porch in the dead of night. They were boys, I could tell, bundled in dark hoodies, pale faces illuminated by the porch light. The taller of the 2 was leaning toward the door, head down, as if embarrassed. The smaller one had his hood pulled low over his face, hiding all but his mouth, which was set in a strange, almost pouty line. I almost opened the door. Almost. Instead, I leaned closer to the peephole, squinting, trying to get a better look. Something held me back. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe it was the way their bodies stood just a little too still, as though they weren't breathing. The taller one lifted his head. I caught my breath as I finally saw his eyes. Or rather, the complete lack of them. His eyes were 2 deep, endless voids, black as midnight and bottomless, as if staring into them could pull me into a dark world from which I'd never escape. Every instinct I had screamed, "Don't open the door." But I was frozen, transfixed. The boy's voice was soft, like the kind of whisper that's both quiet and loud, sending chills racing through my veins. "Please, ma'am, we're lost. We need to use your phone." The request sounded reasonable enough, but something about his voice twisted in my ears. It was devoid of inflection, flat as a corpse's hand. My pulse hammered, and I took a step back, willing myself to breathe, to think rationally. They're just kids, I told myself. Maybe they're in trouble. Maybe I should help. But the smaller boy lifted his head just slightly, and I caught a sliver of blackness under the hood. They both had eyes as dark as night. My breath caught in my throat. I managed to stammer out, I'm sorry. I can't help you." For a moment, they just stood there, and I could feel their gaze piercing through the door. The taller one tilted his head, curious, and then his lips pulled back in a smile that never touched those empty eyes. "Please," he said again, "just let us in. It's so cold out here." He reached out a hand, pressing it flat against the door, and I saw that his skin was as pale as paper, almost translucent. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. "Let us in." The words reverberated through my skull, louder and louder. They seemed to echo, twisting into something that didn't feel like my own thoughts. But I knew one thing. Whatever they were no ordinary kids. I backed away, trembling, forcing myself to break eye contact with the dark voids. As soon as I did, it felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders, like I could breathe again. I turned and sprinted back upstairs, every step echoing in my silent house. I reached my bedroom and shut the door, throwing myself against it as though that thin slab of wood could protect me from whatever was outside. Knock, knock. The sound followed me. Knock, knock. It was relentless, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it seemed to seep through, wrapping around my thoughts, tainting them with fear. Then it stopped. Silence filled the house, broken only by my ragged breathing. Minutes passed, each one slower than the last, and I dared to hope they were gone, that I could just go back to bed and chalk it up to a bad dream, a nightmare conjured by sleep deprivation. But the silence was shattered by a faint whisper creeping through the cracks in my bedroom door. "We know you're in there. Just let us in." I bit down hard on my lip, forcing myself to stay silent. I didn't dare answer. The whispering continued, rising and falling like the rustling of leaves, a constant drone that wore down my resolve with each passing second. I could almost feel their words crawling across my skin. And then I made the mistake of looking at the window. They were outside, staring up at me from the front yard. Somehow, impossibly, they had moved without a sound, now standing side by side in the moonlight. Their faces were tilted up, and those dark eyes were locked onto mine. Even from behind the glass, I could feel their gaze burning into me, a cold, merciless hunger that chilled me to the bone. The taller boy raised his hand, beckoning. "Just open the window," he whispered. His voice was clearer now, louder, and I could swear it was inside my mind, slithering through my thoughts like oil. My hand reached out on its own, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold glass. I could feel them, closer now, so close I could almost smell the damp earth clinging to their clothes. Their eyes seemed to widen, hungry, as I drew closer to the window. But then, a faint spark of sense broke through the fog clouding my mind, and I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the window. "Leave me alone," I shouted, voice hoarse and trembling. "Just go away." Their faces twisted into frowns, and the smaller boy took a step forward, pressing his hands to the glass. His breath fogged it slightly, but his eyes were just as dead and empty. "Please," he whispered, "just let us in. We're so lost." But I could see through it now. It was a plea wrapped in something darker, a hollow echo meant to draw me in, meant to pull me down into that dark, empty place behind their eyes. I backed away until I hit the wall, feeling my heart pound in my throat, blood rushing in my ears. And then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance, a flicker of hope piercing through the suffocating fear. The boys turned their heads toward the sound, faces twisted into expressions of frustration. They took a few steps back, and for the first time I noticed something odd about the way they moved. Stiff, almost mechanical, as if each step was a conscious act of will. One by one, they vanished into the shadows at the edge of my yard, swallowed by the darkness. I stayed rooted to the spot, barely daring to breathe, until the sound of the sirens faded and the silence returned, thick and heavy. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for days. Every knock at the door sent me spiraling into panic, and every shadow on the street outside seemed to be watching, waiting. And every so often, when the nights were quiet and the wind was still, I'd catch the faint echo of a whisper in the distance. "Just let us in,"